Beamy Sloan, 28 years old, HR specialist at a mid-sized consulting firm downtown. My entire job is evaluating people quickly and fairly, reading applications, running structured interviews, flagging behavioral patterns, recommending hires. If there is one thing 3 years in that role teaches you, it's that gut feelings are unreliable. Criteria need to be defined before the interview starts, not adjusted mid-conversation to fit whoever walked in. The moment you let the instrument bend toward the person you're evaluating, the whole exercise is compromised. Started dating again seriously about a year ago after taking a pretty long break. Used apps mostly, did the whole thing, put in the hours. The apps were exhausting in a way that's hard to fully explain to someone who hasn't been on them for an extended period. You spend months writing messages, showing up to coffee dates, sitting across from person after person, and investing real time. And then someone just stops responding one day, and that's it. No reason, no explanation, nothing. Or you get an explanation so vague, it's essentially no reason at all. Just didn't feel the connection, just didn't think we were compatible, just wasn't feeling it right now. Which tells you nothing about yourself and nothing about them, and gives you absolutely nothing to work with going forward. The feedback loop problem was what bothered me more than anything else about the whole experience. At work, any candidate I passed on got at least a standard email, and internally we always documented the specific competency gaps. Not because we were obligated to share that documentation with the candidate, but because it forced honesty about the decision. You had to be able to write down why in clear terms. Dating had none of that structure. Men had been silently rating women forever, filtering people out based on criteria that were never disclosed, never explained, never made accountable to anyone. A woman could show up as her best self and still get ghosted with no feedback whatsoever. And if she ever pushed for a reason, the answer was either silence or something so vague it was meaningless. Meanwhile, the moment a woman expressed a preference or named a standard, the response was predictable. Unrealistic expectations, too picky, as the bar set too high. The asymmetry had irritated me for a long time, but I hadn't found a concrete way to respond to it until I started reading about the scoring approach. Came across it through something online, a few women writing about transparent criteria lists for dating. Nothing completely new. Most people have some version of a mental checklist. But what these women had done was take it further and make it numerical. Actual scores, defined categories, applied consistently, shared openly with the person being evaluated. The logic made sense to me right away. If you're going to evaluate someone, and everyone does whether they admit it or not, do it openly. Put it on paper, make the criteria visible, let both people see the same information. It removes the mystery and the power imbalance. It turns something that's usually one-sided and arbitrary into something mutual and structured. You could push back on a score in a way you couldn't push back on a feeling. Decided to design my own version. Spent 2 evenings on it, went through a few drafts. I wanted exactly 10 categories, nothing more. More than 10 and the instrument loses focus. Less than 10 and you miss something that matters. The categories I landed on were income potential, ambition, emotional intelligence, feminist allyship, communication style, physical presentation, sense of humor, long-term life goals, cultural and social awareness, and a red flag index. Each category out of 10, overall average calculated at the end. The red flag index was a deduction column rather than a standard score. Specific observable behaviors during the conversation would lower the total by a set amount. Repeatedly interrupting, dismissing a question instead of answering it, deflecting personal questions with jokes, giving answers so vague they couldn't be assessed, things like that. I also wrote out a brief definition for each category on a separate reference page. so I knew exactly what a 3 looked like versus a 6 versus a 9 in each column. Income potential was never about finding someone wealthy. It was about direction, whether someone had a sense of where they were going financially. A 2 was no plan and no apparent interest in developing one. A 5 was a steady job with vague future ambitions. An 8 was someone actively building towards something specific with a clear understanding of the steps. Ambition was related to income potential, but separate from it. You could have moderate income potential and still score high on ambition if you were genuinely working towards something meaningful. Emotional intelligence was the hardest category to define, so I gave it 3 sub-indicators to anchor it. Awareness of their own emotional patterns, ability to describe emotional states without becoming defensive when asked about them, and demonstrated empathy during the conversation. Feminist allyship was the one I expected to be most variable. I defined it carefully. Passive acknowledgement, meaning saying you believe in equal rights in a general way, was a 2 or 3. Active engagement, meaning you'd engaged with specific material, had concrete examples, could articulate a structural understanding of inequality, was a 6 or 7. Real integration, meaning your actual choices and behavior reflected that understanding consistently, was an 8 or above. Those top scores would be rare, and I knew it going in. Communication was mostly about clarity and directness, how precisely someone said what they meant without making you dig for it. Physical presentation wasn't about conventional attractiveness. It was about self-awareness, grooming, posture, effort. Humor was timing and lightness without dismissiveness, which was a specific distinction. Life goals was the big-picture compatibility check, whether the direction someone was heading made any sense alongside where I was going. Cultural and social awareness meant whether someone paid attention to the world outside their immediate personal life, and the red flag index was the deduction column. Once the sheet was finalized, I also scored myself using it. Same categories, same criteria, no adjustments. Came out at 8.2 out of 10. I thought that was accurate. High marks on ambition, feminist allyship, cultural awareness, and communication. Lower on emotional intelligence because I know I can default to analysis when a more emotional response would be more appropriate. Lower on humor because I've always been funnier in writing than in person. That one was honest. The 8.2 was my baseline. Any match below a 6 wasn't worth pursuing seriously. 6 to 8 was a maybe, with room for development. Above 8 would be rare, but not impossible. I found out about a speed dating event through a local Facebook group I'd joined a while back. Hadn't planned on going to anything like that format. Always thought they were a bit of a throwback. But the structure clicked with the scoring system in a way that made it seem almost designed for it. Multiple evaluations in a compressed time frame, structured rotation, everyone doing the same thing simultaneously. You'd get more data points in a 2-hour evening than 3 months of app conversations. Bought a ticket and started getting the sheets ready. Printed 6 copies, so I had backups if something happened to one. Put them in a folder in the outer pocket of my bag with a pen clipped to the front cover. My friend called the evening before to ask how I was feeling about it. I said prepared. She asked whether I was actually going to put the sheets on the table where the men could see them. I said yes, that was the whole point. If the scoring was hidden, it wasn't transparent. And if it wasn't transparent, it was just another arbitrary, subjective evaluation with a spreadsheet attached. She made a sound I recognized as her deciding not to push further on that particular point. We talked about other things and hung up. Got to the venue a little early on the night of. Wine bar with a back room sectioned off for the event. Long row of small tables, 2 chairs at each, candles, low music. The organizer was at the entrance, checking people in and running through the format. Men would rotate every 5 minutes, women stay seated. At the end of each round, both people mark their card and hand it to the organizer. She tallies everything at the end and shares mutual scores and any matches. I picked a table toward the middle of the row, set down my bag, pulled out the folder, took out the first sheet, and placed it flat on the table in front of me. Face up, visible, pen at the top right corner. A woman at the table 2 spots down leaned in slightly to look at what was on the paper. She didn't say anything. I didn't offer an explanation. A couple of other women glanced over from closer tables. The organizer did a final count of the room and said they were starting. The men came through from the other side and each found their first seat. Timer started. Garrett sat down across from me first. Early 30s at most, plain clothes, neat about it. His eyes went to the sheet on the table before they went to me. I introduced myself and went straight to the explanation without waiting. 10 categories, each out of 10. I'd be filling this in as we talked. Both of us had cards. Scores would be shared by the organizer at the end, so this was a two-way evaluation. Garrett was quiet through the whole explanation. He looked at the sheet again once I finished, then looked up at me and said something along the lines of, "Okay, right." Just that, nothing additional. I took it as acknowledgement and started with the first question. Asked what he did for work. He said software, infrastructure related, kept it brief. Gave a department description and didn't elaborate past what was directly asked. I wrote a number in the income potential column, didn't say it out loud. Asked about where he was trying to go in the next few years, what he was working toward. He gave a short answer about a project he was currently involved in, technically specific, nothing that indicated a longer-term personal vision. Marked ambition lower than income potential. Moved through the next few categories. Humor was difficult to assess because he wasn't saying enough to demonstrate any. Cultural awareness actually scored decently because the limited things he did say showed some awareness beyond his immediate work context. Emotional intelligence was harder to gauge. He was answering every question with the minimum number of words that qualified as an answer, which could be privacy, could be discomfort. I noted both as possibilities. Got to feminist allyship. Asked how he thought about gender equality in his day-to-day life and work. Garrett looked at me for a moment and then said he tried to treat everyone the same regardless. I wrote 3 out of 10 in that column. Not because the sentiment was wrong in isolation. Treating people fairly is a baseline ethical position. But it showed no engagement with why people aren't treated the same by default, which was the actual question. Someone who actively understood systemic inequality would have said something different. They'd have had a specific example, a reference point, a more concrete articulation of what that understanding looked like in practice. I explained this briefly while writing the number. Garrett watched me write it and didn't respond. After that, the answers got shorter. If they'd been minimal before, they became minimal and deliberate after that point. Still technically complete, 1 or 2 sentences each, but nothing unprompted, no additional context offered. I kept moving through the categories. By the time the timer went off, I had almost everything filled in. Garrett stood up, gave a single nod, said it was nice to meet me, and moved to the next table. No additional comment about the sheet, no pushback, nothing. I finished calculating the score, 4.5 out of 10. In the comment box, I wrote, emotionally unavailable, likely intimidation response. The pattern was familiar from interview situations. A candidate who goes quiet and minimal midway through a structured evaluation has made a decision to disengage rather than continue engaging. They've assessed the situation and decided that withdrawal is safer than participation. It's not shyness. Shyness looks different. Shyness wants to engage. It's just struggling to get there. What Garrett did was a deliberate recalibration. He registered the setup, ran some internal calculation, and pulled back, which meant the setup had triggered something specific for him. which was itself a data point worth keeping. Bo came in after the rotation, sat down with the energy of someone walking into a room they already expect to be comfortable in. His eyes went to the sheet before he was fully seated, and the first thing he said, almost before I'd had a chance to say anything, was something like, "Is this a date? Or are you doing intake?" The tone was genuinely amused, not hostile, which I registered as more engaging than silence. I went through the explanation again, same framing as with Garrett. He listened, leaned back slightly when I finished, and said he could work with that. The conversation actually flowed well for the first stretch of the round, better than the first. He was easy to talk to in a specific way, asked questions back, which Garrett hadn't done at all, made a few dry observations about the room that were accurate and kind of funny. I found myself less focused on the sheet for a few minutes than I had been in the previous round, which I noted as something to watch. Social fluency is its own form of distraction, and I didn't want it inflating the scores. Charm and genuine substance are different categories and needed to stay that way. Got to the ambition question partway through, asked where he saw himself in 5 years. He gave an answer about growing his freelance work into a proper operation, some detail about what that would look like structurally, scored him in the middle range on ambition, which felt accurate. There was something there, but the plan was still loosely defined. I wrote the number in the column, didn't announce it, but didn't hide it either. Bo noticed me writing it. The conversation continued from there, but the quality shifted slightly. The answers became more contained after that point. Still complete, still polite, but less expansive than the first half of the round. Like a dial had been turned down by a few notches. He realized he was being tracked in a real-time way, and the warmth became slightly managed, which was interesting as a behavioral observation. The shift was probably instinctive, more than calculated, but the effect was the same. Near the end of the round, I asked the allyship question. How did he think about gender dynamics in relationships and more broadly? He said something about equality and mutual respect. That was roughly the whole answer. I wrote 4 out of 10 and explained that general statements about equality without specific engagement didn't score high in that category. He nodded once, slowly. Didn't push back, didn't ask what specific engagement would have looked like, just nodded, which was its own kind of response. When the timer went off, he stood up and looked at his own card for a moment, wrote something down, taking his time with it, angling the card slightly so I couldn't see, then said good luck tonight before walking toward the main bar area. The tone was perfectly calibrated, not warm, not cold, just neutral in a way you couldn't attach anything specific to. I finished his score, 5 out of 10. Comment: surface-level social fluency, disengaged when specificity was required, possible avoidance pattern. The humor scores had been real. I wasn't going to revise those downward just because the back half of the round was less engaging. But the allyship score and the ambition score were both middle of the range at best, and the behavioral shift after the first number had been written was something worth keeping in the record. Callum sat down for the third round, noticeably older than the other two, mid-40s at minimum. Settled into the chair without the usual adjusting and settling in. Just sat down, looked at the sheet, then looked at me. Took a moment before saying anything, then asked, in a tone that wasn't unfriendly but also wasn't soft, whether I was aware this was supposed to be a date. I said yes. Went through the explanation for the third time. He let me finish the whole thing without interrupting, which credit where it was due was more than a couple of the others had managed. Then he sat back and said something to the effect that I'd already decided what a good answer looked like before he'd said anything. I said that was the point. The criteria were defined in advance to remove bias from the evaluation. He said that wasn't what defining criteria in advance did. His framing was that locking the criteria before the conversation started didn't remove bias. It just froze whatever assumptions were built into the criteria and then called it objectivity. I said the categories were derived from my actual values and needs, not from external assumptions. He said that was the same thing. I asked what his alternative was. He said showing up and seeing what happened. I said that was exactly how every subjective evaluation had ever been justified. You trust your instincts, and instincts are demonstrably biased. He said he agreed instincts were biased, and didn't think that meant a scoring sheet was the answer. I wrote a note in the margin of my sheet, then started on the questions. Callum answered everything directly and without decoration. Work in 2 sentences. Goals in specific terms without elaboration. Communication was actually the highest I'd scored that evening on that particular category. He said what he meant without hedging or performing around it. But then I got to the allyship question, asked how he thought about gender inequality and whether he engaged with it actively. He said he didn't think about it in those terms, said that in his experience, the question of how to treat people well wasn't something he organized around ideological frameworks. I wrote 2 out of 10 in that column. For someone his age, that response was almost to be expected. Men from that generation often hadn't engaged with the structural conversation in any meaningful way. The work of interrogating what they'd absorbed from their upbringing simply hadn't happened. The emotional intelligence score was harder to assess because he wasn't giving me much emotional material to work with. Everything was clear and direct, but not particularly self-reflective in the way the category required. When the timer went off, he stood up, took one last look at the sheet on the table, then said before turning away that the system was going to tell me exactly what I wanted to hear. And then he left. 4 out of 10. Comment: defensive, generationally limited on allyship, resistant to structured framing, classic male toxicity dressed as philosophical pushback. What he'd said on the way out registered as the thing a certain kind of man says when he wants to undermine a methodology without engaging with the actual substance of it. You call the instrument unreliable, so the results don't have to be addressed. It was a move that protected against accountability by questioning the frame. I'd seen it before, not in dating, but in performance review cycles at work. The employee who spends the first 10 minutes of the review explaining why the review process is flawed, so that anything discussed afterward can be dismissed as the output of a broken system. It looked like wisdom from the outside, but it was just discomfort with being measured. After Callum, there were 4 more rounds. None of them reached the engagement level I'd hoped for across the board. One man was visibly nervous the whole time and kept glancing at the sheet without ever acknowledging that it was there, which I noted as low communication. He couldn't even name the things sitting between us on the table. Another kept laughing at things that weren't funny, the anxious kind of laughter that fills silence rather than responding to humor. A third gave long answers that managed to contain very little actual information. And the last one, the 7th, was the closest thing to a real engagement I got that evening. He'd actually addressed the allyship question in a way that went past the usual generalities, mentioned something specific about how he'd thought about household labor distribution in a previous relationship and how his thinking on it had shifted. That got him the highest allyship score of the evening and brought his total up to 5.5 out of 10. Still not above my threshold, but closer to it than anyone else. When the last round finished, the organizer collected all the cards and sheets. Said she'd be about 10 minutes. The room shifted into a low-key social mode. People at nearby tables started talking to each other, some checking their phones. Garrett was near the door already in his jacket. Beau was a few tables away talking to a woman who was laughing at something he'd said, same easy energy he'd walked in with. Callum wasn't in the room at all. must have slipped out while the later rounds were running. I looked over my notes while I waited. 7 men, scores ranging from 3.5 to 5.5 on my end, not a single one above the 6 threshold, which wasn't completely surprising given the sample, but was still something to sit with. The organizer came back with a folder and started at the front of the room. Format was straightforward. She'd read both scores for each pair, flag any mutual interest, move on. Got to my name after working through most of the list. Garrett's score for me, 3 out of 10. Beau's score for me, 2 out of 10. Then Callum. He hadn't put a number at all. Where the score was supposed to be, he'd written assessment not applicable in this format and left the box blank. So, 2 numbers and a refusal. The average of the 2 numbers was 2.5. I had given those 3 men an average of 4.5. The room was doing the usual post-results low conversation, people comparing notes with each other. I stayed still for a moment, looking at what the organizer had read out. Garrett was already out the door. Beau had moved with the woman he'd been talking to toward the main bar. Nobody from my end of the rotation was anywhere near my table. The organizer finished with the rest of the list and asked if anyone had questions about the format or the evening. I said the men's responses seemed to suggest they hadn't been prepared for a transparent mutual evaluation system. She nodded, in that particular way people nod when they've been polite through a long shift and have stopped actively processing. Said she hoped I'd had a good evening and moved on to someone at the other end of the row. I packed up my sheets, all 7 of them, all filled in, and commented, folded them once, and pushed them into the side pocket of my bag. The corner of the stack stuck out a little, but I didn't push it down. Picked up my jacket and walked out through the main bar area. It was colder outside than when I'd arrived. Stood on the pavement for a moment and called my friend. She picked up fairly quickly. I told her the system had worked and confirmed what I'd suspected about the current dating pool. She asked what that meant specifically. I said it meant the options at that kind of event were below the threshold I'd defined, all of them, and that was useful data to have. She asked what scores they'd given me. I told her. She was quiet for a moment before saying anything, then said carefully that they had all scored me lower than I had scored them. I said yes, that was what I'd just told her. She pointed out that I had scored them low, too. I said yes, because they had scored low. The categories were there to assess whether someone met a defined bar, and in this case, none of them had. She asked whether I'd thought about what their criteria might look like. I said I didn't know what their criteria were because they hadn't disclosed them, which was exactly the problem with how men approach dating. Everything subjective, nothing transparent, no accountability. She made a sound I couldn't read clearly, then said she'd talk to me tomorrow and got off the call. I stood there for a second with the phone in my hand. The street was mostly empty. A few people walking toward the station. Started walking that way. On the train, I had the bag on my lap, and the corner of the folded sheets was still sticking out from the side pocket. Thought about Callum's exit comment. The system was going to tell me exactly what I wanted to hear. Turned it over again, and still couldn't make it land as anything more than deflection. The system had told me everyone scored below a 6. I had not wanted to hear that. I had gone there hoping to find someone who met the criteria. That was the whole purpose of going. The system had told me they didn't. That was not confirmation. That was a disappointing result. Confirmation bias would have looked like going in with criteria and then inflating the scores to match what I'd hoped for. I hadn't done that. The scores were what they were based on what each man had said and how he'd engaged. So the comment was wrong. And the comment was also a specific rhetorical pattern. You don't engage with the substance, you undermine the method, you call the instrument unreliable before it produces any output, so the output can be pre-dismissed. Garrett had done the same thing physically, going quiet and minimal. Beau had done it socially, staying warm on the surface, while withdrawing any real engagement from underneath. Callum had done it rhetorically, positioning resistance as insight. 3 different behavioral responses to the same underlying discomfort, which was the discomfort of being evaluated, of being measured against criteria someone else had defined, which was, of course, the standard experience for women in dating for as long as anyone could remember. Men had been doing exactly that forever, silently, without disclosure, with full authority over the outcome and no obligation to explain it. And the moment one woman put a piece of paper on a table and said, "Here are my criteria, you can see them, we're doing this openly," the response was 3 different flavors of avoidance: passive, performative, and rhetorical, which told you something fairly clear about where the discomfort actually came from. It wasn't being scored that bothered them. It was being scored by someone else on someone else's terms, with the results visible to both parties. Got home and made tea. Sat at the kitchen table with all 7 sheets spread out in front of me. Looked at the whole data set together for the first time. Average score I'd given the men across all 7, 4.6. Average score they'd given me across all of them, somewhere around 2.8 when I worked it out properly. Gap of 1.8 points, consistent across the whole sample. Looked at it column by column, going through my own scoring. Allyship was strict, but it was strictly defined and applied the same way each time. Income potential and ambition were in the middle range for most of them, which felt accurate. Communication scores were where I'd been most generous, giving partial credit for men who had answered the questions, even when the answers were brief. The methodology wasn't flawless, but it wasn't sloppy either. The gap wasn't an artifact of the system. The gap was real, and the most consistent explanation for it was the one that had been forming through the whole evening. These men had walked into a structured evaluation run by a woman and had responded with resistance in various forms. Their scores of me were shaped by that resistance more than by any genuine assessment. A 2 from Beau, who had given me single-word answers for the back half of a 5-minute round, was not a serious evaluation. A 3 from Garrett, who had essentially stopped engaging 40 seconds in, was not a serious evaluation. The blank from Callum was a position statement, not a score. All of it was noise. Stayed up going through the sheets and making notes for the next version. The allyship category was going to be split into 2, passive awareness and active engagement, 5 points each, so the total remained out of 10. The red flag index needed more specific behavioral anchors. The current version was too open to interpretation. I was thinking about adding an accountability category, something that assessed specifically how someone responded to receiving information they hadn't anticipated or hadn't wanted. It was the thing none of the men had done well. Not just the 3 rounds I'd described here, but across most of the 7. Being given an unexpected data point and responding constructively, rather than through withdrawal or deflection. That seemed like the most diagnostic question the instrument could ask, and right now it wasn't being captured directly. Made the notes, took photos of all 7 sheets, folded them back into the folder, put the folder on the kitchen counter, and turned off the light. A few days went by. Callum's comment kept surfacing on commutes, in the gap between tasks, during the quiet minutes in the office. Not in a distressing way exactly, more like a signal that hadn't fully resolved yet. I'd worked through the logic of it enough times to know it was wrong. The system had not confirmed what I wanted to hear. I'd wanted to find someone above the threshold, and the system had told me I hadn't. That was the opposite of confirmation. But the thought kept coming back anyway. My friend brought it up when we spoke a few days later. She'd been quiet about it since the night of, and I hadn't pushed. She asked whether I thought any of them had felt like they were being met. I said I'd explained the system clearly each time, been direct about what I was doing, There was nothing hidden about any of it. She said she knew that, and asked again whether I thought they had felt met as people. I didn't really answer that. Changed the subject to something about work. She let it go. Finished the second version of the sheet the following week. 11 categories now. Tighter definitions, the split allyship columns, a new accountability section. Printed 5 copies and filed them in a clean folder. Looked at the folder sitting on the counter next to the bag. Thought about the evening one more time. The long row of tables, the candles, the rotation timer going off every 5 minutes. Garrett already by the door in his jacket before the results were even finished. Bo talking to someone at the bar with the same easy surface that he'd walked in with, the dial turned all the way back up. The organizer's polite, tired nod. Callum's coat already gone before she'd finished reading the list. 3 out of 10, 2 out of 10. Assessment not applicable in this format. I'd been turning over the question of whether those numbers said anything real about me or just about them. The answer was them, logically. The methodology was sound, the categories were defined, the scoring was consistent. The men had responded to the evaluation itself rather than to me specifically. Their numbers reflected discomfort with being measured, not any accurate read of who I was or what I was worth. I believe that. I did believe that. The folder sat on the counter with the new sheets inside it. The old sheets from the first event were still in the side pocket of my bag where I'd put them that night. Hadn't taken them out yet. It had been close to 2 weeks. Didn't take them out now either. Put the new folder in the bag next to them. The corner of both stacks was sticking out of the side pocket a little. The next event was in about 3 weeks. The criteria were better this time. That was the thing to focus on.